Welcome to the Pitt Rivers Museum. My name is Andrew McClellan, and tonight's live conversation will be delivered by Shalini Ganendra and is titled Views of Ceylon, Veins of Interest, and is part of our Radical Hope online programme. Just something on Radical Hope. Radical Hope events aim to explore contemporary changes in museums and to reimagine museum practice. They focus on how Western museums have relied on colonial ideas that have hidden or erased the many stories and ways of knowing in favour of promoting one viewpoint. The reimagined museum should be a place that supports all people to share their ways of knowing and tell their stories. This series is led by researchers and global community partners from around the world, and these events are funded by Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. Now, just before I pass over, a little bit about Shalini. Shalini Ganendra is an Associate Academic of the History of Art Department and Research Associate at St Catherine's College. Her research focus is early colonial photography of Ceylon. Shalini read law at Cambridge and practiced in New York before transitioning into the culture sphere, where she's evolved over 2 decades, developing exhibitions and collections, interdisciplinary programming and publication. She's Sri Lankan born with a long-standing interest in photography, image and identity. We welcome her to speak about the focus of investigation during her visiting fellowship at the Pitt Rivers Museum, the Views of Ceylon album and more. Shalini, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Welcome all. I think, can everyone see that? Is that clear?
That is clear, yes.
Right, okay. Well, welcome all. Again, thank you, Andrew, and the Pitt Rivers Museum for this wonderful invitation. This morning, or this afternoon, I should say, I'd like to take you through what has been really a very exciting and rewarding discovery in terms of a collection in the context of advancing the veins of influence theory that I have been working on. I've had the opportunity to look at a previously uninvestigated collection, fortunately for me, serendipitously, of images of Ceylon. And we're going to look at it as a case study for broader application on the way we view images and perhaps look through our research in future. I'd like to start by, first of all, inviting you, before we start looking at these images, to keep in mind, to consider, what do you see when you see the screen in front of you? Where could these places be? What does the collection, the content and the order say about the collector and about collecting? How do these images, how may they have been viewed in the late 1800s at the advent of photography? What would have been the first impression that these images gave about the place to which they refer? How do you view these images now, and what impressions of Ceylon do they give? What is your current impression of Sri Lanka? What comes to mind when you hear the name? And just by way of background, Sri Lanka gained independence in 1948. Prior to independence, the country's name was Ceylon. At the end of our discussion, consider how have your views of Ceylon and of Sri Lanka been influenced? Let's have a look at what's in the Pitt Rivers Museum in terms of colonial photography predating 1910. So as to give some background into the existing collecting dynamic and the developing collecting dynamic through the addition of the collection that we will focus on later. This is what is in the public domain currently. We see very traditionally ethnographic type images. This particular one is of a man from Batticaloa, a Tamil gentleman. I'm going to work through, by the way, the images quite quickly, so it's going to be difficult for you to read them. This talk will be available through the Pitt Rivers Museum after we finish, so do take your time to read through the titles and the information provided on each slide. We see here 2 women, younger, elder, again in the traditional ethnographic style. a composite, a lovely sort of scrapbook arrangement of various images, loosely labeled, very little information on provenance trail or identification in most cases. So we see groups of people in some studio shots, mostly in a natural environment. Mat weavers, unidentified. I can confirm these are images of Vedas, who are the indigenous group in Ceylon. There was a lot of interest in the study of Vedas. The Rhodia caste of women, again, a lot of interest, and may become obvious as to why. That was their traditional garb. There are the low caste individuals in the Ceylon caste system. We have the Kandian Dancers, also termed the Devil Dancers, a portrait of a gentleman, a group of individuals casually posing for the camera, a lovely thatch roofed house in the background, a group of women looking less happy, and lovely thick grove of bamboo with a group of individuals. And then more studio images, beautifully rendered, portraiture images. We see the details of the jewelry and the costume. A fisherman, this is a postcard. Another image in the context of an urban scene. And this is an interesting image because it's really the only one that, first of all, shows a connection with empire, and also shows a high-class group of individuals from Ceylon. Here we have Lady Montague Burrows. The photograph is circa 1906. Her husband, Sir Stephen Montague Burrows, was a traveler. He wrote about the excavations in Anuradhapura, which is part of the cultural triangle, Anuradhapura, Puran, Narua, and Sigiriya, which were all of great interest archaeologically during empire, written about extensively, and we will see later also photographed and documented by a photographer that the new collection will introduce us to. Now consider the variances in this collection that follows. How do we engage with these images and the content as narrated? What do they add to the visual narrative of Ceylon that the Pitt Rivers Museum offers? And what can this collection offer beyond the visual impact and its immediate content? The collection that we are about to review was all contained in this beautiful Views of Ceylon album. It's a large leather-bound, actually very well preserved, with gilt border and gilt lettering, with a small note, an inscription on the interior, Views of Ceylon, presented by LAS Jermyn. Now, the provenance trail of this collection is unclear before 2010. It came into the PRM collection in 2010 from the School of Geography Library. But prior to that, we do not know how it came to be from LAS Jermyn into the Oxford University enclave. We can speculate that perhaps LAS Jermyn, who is an alumni of Keble College, might have gifted the album to the college, and thereafter the college, which had close associations with the School of Geography, passed it on to that school, and then from the school to PRM. However, it is fortuitous and fortunate that this collection has found refuge in the Pitt Rivers Museum and not some charity shop or an auction, as many a collection has done. So the landing itself ascribes significant value to its influence, continuing and past. Just very briefly, the contents of the album. There are 44 large photographic prints. There's one vignette of a botanical image signed C. Simmons. There are 2 photographs of coffee plantation scenery, 4 photographs of illustrations affixed on one face page. There is a loose list of photographs that documents some of the photographs in the collections. There's one loose photographic image of a turbaned man, and interestingly also a loose sepia-toned painting on a card with a handwritten title and notations CFGC. It should be noted also that the presentation of all these materials is very varied. The first 37 images are very well placed, with empty pages to the left and image on the right. And then the arrangement becomes a little more scattered. There's also these loose materials that are inserted into the album, and the album is only about a third full, with many lovely blank pages which seemed like they anticipated filling, but they were never filled. So the inscription, Views of Ceylon, presented by LAS Jermyn. It is really the first clue from which we work backwards to identifying the provenance trail and the history and the story of this collection, real, putative, and most likely. LAS Jermyn, Lancelot Ambrose Scudmore Jermyn, was born in Lucknow, India. His father was a parish priest. He studied at Keble College. And though there is no evidence of travel to Ceylon, let alone stay in Ceylon, he actually spent time in Malaya as a teacher. LAS's grandfather, his paternal grandfather, was Bishop Hugh Jermyn, who spent time in Ceylon. And it is likely that he is the original collector and owner of the Views of Ceylon album. Hugh Willoughby Jermyn was an Anglican bishop from Swatham in Cambridgeshire. He was educated at Westminster and Trinity Hall, Cambridge, which actually happens to be my college quite by chance. The college does not have any archival materials of Bishop Jermyn other than noting that he did attend the hall. He's clearly, he was an illustrious churchman. He was the Bishop of Colombo from 1871 to 1875 and had to resign early after suffering from serious illness. He then took up a post as the very important primus of the Scottish Episcopal Church, a position he held until 1901, 2 years before he passed. He is a celebrated bishop, and his tenure in Sri Lanka or Ceylon is documented in the history of the Diocese of Colombo, the centenary edition. He is noted for his very hard-working, fastidious, generous tenure as bishop. He traveled throughout the country, visiting all congregations, saying Mass, investing his own funds for programming, extending the mission of the Church of England through a very personal touch. And clearly from the writings in this publication, it becomes evident that he was a highly respected man, and all regretted his early resignation due to ill health. So I think that all these materials support the conclusion that Bishop Jermyn was an influencer by virtue of the great influence he would have imparted. His influencer status would have come through his leading position in the powerful Church of England. He was well educated, well traveled. He would have been a voice heard and respected with extended influence on congregation, church, socially, and possibly government. Essentially, his views would have had gravitas, and we can transfer that gravitas to the realm in which, or to the realm that this collection occupies. So let us consider how this collection might have been used and viewed given the host that it is so-called born from, I would say, or embraced by. Views of Ceylon. Let's look at the folio contents finally. And again, as I say, I'll just flick through. Please feel free to revisit this presentation at your leisure. Here is an image of the list of photographs in the album, or some of the photographs in the album. We have 1 through 26 on this page on the verso. There are another number. The photographs are not identified. The photographer is not identified, but on the list there is reference to a J. Lawton. And just we can connect now some images in this album with images elsewhere. In particular, there is an album in the Princeton University collection, also called Views of Ceylon, with a very similar construct in terms of the aesthetic of the album. And in that album, there are duplicate photographs, some duplicate photographs of the photographs found in the Jermyn Folio. Who was Joseph Lawton? A very famous photographer. His work, at least, is very, very famous. He was commissioned by the government to do an archaeological survey. So what he is most renowned for is photographs of the ruins of Ceylon in that cultural triangle, Anuradhapura, Polonnaruwa, and Sigiriya. Interestingly, for being so famous, there's very little biographical information on him, though we do know that he operated in Ceylon between 1866 and 1872. So really, his photographs have become his legacy. We do not know when he was born. We do not know when he died. We have passing reference to his death made by the chair of the Royal Asiatic Society in Ceylon in minutes of the meeting sometime in 1874. So we know that Lawton would have passed before then. Now let's look at the contents of the collection. I have separated it just for convenience in terms of clusters, and the clusters vary, as you will see, based on the actual material content as well as the aesthetics, and perhaps also distinguished by time as well as location and geography. Here we have the first cluster. These are all images by Lawton. Lovely scenic views of Kandy, which is a hill country, hill city. It's formerly the kingdom and the center of Ceylon. Have lovely views. This is the most important Buddhist temple in the country, which is called, it's colloquially known as the Temple of the Tooth, and it houses the Buddha relic. There is the Perahara, which is celebrated annually, celebrating those anniversaries related to Buddhism, and it continues as the mainstay of Buddhist worship. Here we have the Kandy Lake, these lovely scenic views. Again, the Kandy Temple. We have a lovely little bungalow occupied, it's Fairyland Bungalow, occupied by a British expat. Foliage, river, different views. This is Norelia, which is a tea and coffee. It's another beautiful hill station, cool climate. The Mahavali Ganga, which runs through the country, now currently used for hydro. It's a very powerful symbol of growth. And here we have, interestingly, the 2,000-acre Rothschild's estate, which was started around 1840, not by the Rothschild family, but by cousins of the Rothschilds, the de Worms. And we can speculate that the Rothschild's name was used with permission for better branding, or maybe the Rothschilds might have invested in the venture, but the real leaders of this estate were the de Worm brothers. And it started off as a coffee plantation and then transitioned to tea after 1869, at which time the coffee industry suffered greatly in Ceylon and was essentially eradicated by a coffee plague. We have roads cut through rock. Another bungalow. This is a Rumborder rest house, which is where Bishop Jermyn may well have stayed during his sojourn. These are government rest houses which were dotted throughout the country and remain dotted throughout the country, where one can stay en route. And here we have the roads that have been cut out. Now, realize also that part of the empire narrative, of course, was the development of infrastructure. So we have colonial engineers coming in to create roads and bridges, to build construction, to facilitate the flow of economy and movement through the country. Have another lovely scenic view. A river view, first signs of habitation, albeit distant. Here we have another road going across the falls. And this is really a devastated coffee plantation. We can conjecture that perhaps it's a clearing after the fungal virus attacked the coffee plants, and again, the end and the sign of a new beginning in terms of the tea industry developing. Roads through the mountainside. Adams Peak. And this wonderful singular tall talipot palm, which has fascinated illustrators as well as photographers during this period of empire. And we'll see it appear actually 2 more times in this collection and then beyond. There's a view of Colombo City, Galface, which is one of the central areas, and the main Hindu temple in Colombo, which is in Willoughby. It still stands today. And the interesting connection with regard to these places of worship would be that the Hindus and the Buddhists were the congregations and the groups who would have been the focus of missionary work in order to convert them to Christianity. And indeed, they are the Christians in the country today. So having sight of the original indigenous places of worship would have been relevant to the missionary discourse. Railway tracks, railway, rivers. Lovely waterfall, very dramatic Rumborder. Again, scenic views. Very picturesque, very Eden-esque, a bridge over water. And this is the Christ Church Cathedral, which would have been Bishop Jermyn's mainstay, the main cathedral in the country, located in Colombo. And now we see 11 photographs, not in the least, but also attributed to Joseph Lawton. There's overlap with images in the Princeton Lawton album. I should add, the Princeton Lawton album, the images actually have the Lawton stamp on them. So hence the confirmation of creator. Lovely big road. Again, the Kandy Temple of the Tooth. Railway tracks, reminiscent of the last photograph, referring back to the last photograph with the train. Here we have the talipot palm again. Wonderful picturesque scenic view, river, waterways, cleared coffee plantation, again, the Kandian temple, a fern, and again, the talipot palm. And then there's a change in terms of the presentation. It becomes very much more casual. The following materials are pasted on facing pages. They're not as good quality. Certainly the photographs, the size is smaller, the quality of the paper less refined. And then there's also the introduction of these illustrations. So the photographs are of illustrations. Here we see 4 photographs, which turns out to be of illustrations, and from where we will find out shortly. Why they've been chosen, we don't know yet. And here is the image of, this is a painting by an individual with these initials. It's of the Indian rubber trees. We can attribute this to Peridanian gardens, we find out later. And inscribed on the back is the inscription Ika. So who is this by? What is the context of these images? CFGC is Constance Fredricka Gordon Cummings, a very famous Victorian artist who was also an adventurer, an aristocrat and adventurer. She spent 2 years in Ceylon. She stayed with the Jermyns for the whole period and traveled through the country with them. She subsequently wrote a book, 2 Happy Years in Ceylon, which loosely follows the format of a number of travel books written during that genre, but there is a significant departure, first of all, because she uses her own artistic illustrations for the publication, and there are a number, there are over 19, depending on the editions, and she speaks a lot in a very personal context, interweaving the life with the Jermyns. So we can see here a vein of influence coming in through this artist and through her work, introducing the travel publication that then comes in to inform the images that we see. And here we see the original painting that is in the Jermyn Folio and the illustration in the book, also called the Indian Avenue of Indian Rubber Trees in Peridania Gardens. Peridania Gardens, which exist today, is the very famous botanical gardens that was also the gardens originally of the king of Kandy, and then taken over by the colonials to propagate species and study and do botanical study. So it continues today to serve those purposes, and a very beautiful site, not only for tourists, but for further study, endeavor, and of course, artistic interaction and influence. So the interesting focus or the meaning of the Ficus elastica, the Indian rubber tree, for Ceylon is that the species is from the tree of life. It is also where the Buddha is supposed to have reached enlightenment. It is attractive, it's exotic, it's also economic as a source of rubber or a potential source of rubber. So the species was in fact the subject, most likely for its incredible beauty and exoticism, of many photographs during this period. So why these photographs? Why were these illustrations selected from the 19 possible illustrations that are in Ika's publication? Perhaps the Jermyns owned these images, perhaps their favorites because of their aesthetic affiliation or appeal. Perhaps they bring to mind certain memories of travel, or all of the above. We do not know, but certainly we have confirmed that these are from Ika's publication. And here we see an interesting interplay between a photograph in the Jermyn collection and what then later is shown as the cover of Ika's book, which is of course also one of her illustrations. But the similarity between the photograph and the cover of the book, her drawing, here we have a dynamic developing between the illustration and the photograph, which makes us ask and wonder, how much did the photographs in this collection influence Ika's own illustrations? Did she participate in the selection of the photographs? Did she go with the Germans to specifically custom order these photographs to give her opinion, or did she happen to view them in the Germans' home and then be influenced by them? But certainly there is a very strong hint of the relationship between the photographic image and the publication. Now, before we move on to the final cluster of photographs, just keep in mind that what we've seen so far in terms of the Lawton images, certainly, we see the picturesque, we see these Edenist landscapes with perspectives of mountains and rivers and waterfalls and dales. We see the main temples, the Buddhist and the Hindu, and what would have been Jermyn's own cathedral. We see the economics of tea and of coffee plantations. We see the marvels of British infrastructural endeavor through the railways, through the bridges and the roads. And we see the exotic botanics, which were a source of wonder and study, showing also, of course, the majestic talipot. So we have to wonder, were these images strategically collected? Were they purely aesthetic? Were they both, conscious or unconsciously? But certainly these images can be loosely grouped in this way, insofar as the images that they, impressions that they offer. Then we have the last cluster, which definitely is arranged in much more of a scrapbook dynamic, very casual, mixed photographs and postcards with the possible introduction of a new geography and a new generation. No explanations are given. Here we have two images of one of a coffee clearing, unknown photographer, and a waterfall. Again, the photograph just is not nearly as beautiful as the ones that we have seen by Lawton that precede these. Here we have the botanical vignette signed C. Symonds, 1873, which would have been the time that the Germans were in Ceylon. Was C. Symonds a guest of the Germans, or a visitor, an admirer, a congregation, a parishioner? We don't know, all of the above. And then finally, we have a postcard, or a photograph, which was loosely positioned. And initially, when I encountered the image, I really was quite excited, because the collection is effectively peopleless. It's an uninhabited collection. And I thought that maybe this would have been a personal photograph that would somehow lead to a connection with Ceylon and the Germans' personal connection with Ceylon. It's interesting that the photograph is of a Muslim man, because the Muslims were not the focus of any missionary work, because conversion was not allowed, and so by their own religion, and so it seemed quite a paradoxical, that an anomaly. This image was an anomaly. So quite disappointingly, the image turns out to be a postcard, and it is also found in the Rijksmuseum collection in the Netherlands. So there is a strong chance or support for the belief that this postcard would have been introduced through Elias Jermyn, who was based in Malaya. And here we see a clear generational introduction, an addition to the collection of a photograph, of a postcard, that most likely, I'd like to think, was important to him. And so he included it in this collection. Now, consider how might this collection have been shared at that time by Hugh Jermyn. So again, we've loosely categorized the images, but the picturesque sensibilities show maybe a personal preference and the Edenesque beauty of Ceylon, possibly to entice missionaries to take up posts in Ceylon, to inform individuals of the places of worship, the Buddhist and Hindu traditions being the main religions for conversion to Christianity. Certainly referencing economies of empire, showing the tea and coffee interests. We have infrastructure development to ease travel, so the roads, bridges, railways, and nice houses. There's certainly a very personal ethos to this collection. It's a collection of collective and generational memories with additions from other family, children, grandchildren, and kept in the family until there were no more. L.A.S. Jermyn's only son and only child predeceased him. He was a casualty of war. So this collection really becomes a testament to personal memories of travels and encounters, giving a visual impression of Ceylon, which is exotic and civilized, but also barely habitable or habited. The defining points for this collection, as I would see, is the direct connection to Ceylon through the main collector, which really brings a personal narrative and engagement. It gives depth and placement and context. This is a personal collection as opposed to being a collected collection or a commercial collection, a secondary market collection, which have their own value, but a different value. This here we see a personal dynamic and a personal view. Therefore, also the fact that he's an influencer and it's an influencer's personal collection, layered with these later editions, we see that it speaks to us in a more meaningful way. Somehow there is additional gravitas assigned to this collection. The location of the collection we should consider. Why is this collection not in Lambeth Palace or the church archives, given that the main collector or person associated with the collection would be the bishop himself? I would assert that it is because of the personal value of the collection. So the collection was kept in the family generationally and only given away after the line ends. And now, fortuitously, it is in a public collection and has come into the public domain after nearly 150 years. So let's consider the veins of influence, which is really the idea that I am developing through this research, using Ceylon as a case study, but the concept is, of course, very extendable through all areas of research and not just limited to the image. But if we look at the veins of influence here, let's look at the photographs and the collection materials. We need to consider them, the image connections to ecology, horticulture, plantations, economy, infrastructure, and worship, the aesthetic preferences of the period that are shown through these photographs. Lawton was, after all, a commercial photographer. He photographed images that he thought would sell and cater to a tourist market. These were the picturesque images that appealed to the colonials and actually came back to Britain. The collecting dynamics, we need to consider the individual, the familiar, and of course the commercial as just described. The individuals in the collection, the faces of the collection, Hugh Jermyn, L.A.S. Jermyn, Constance Cummings. The Church of England, surely, and the religious practice and endeavors of the church. Buddhism and Hinduism, the interface with Christianity and missionary work. We need to consider the intersections of photography with drawing, of illustration, and the cross influences. travel writing, of course, and the impact of those words on these images and how they give added life and vice versa. We have to consider that dynamic synergy, the connection to Malaya through the introduction of the postcard, the Muslim migration connecting Malaya and Ceylon, perhaps. That is another vein that should be considered, and the postcard may reveal more specific identification about the figure featured. The collection, where is its home now? It's in the PRM. So let's consider institutional collecting dynamics and exhibition. And of course, in the future, very importantly, the contemporary presentation to further influence, growing new veins to inform views of Ceylon and the way we look at image, the way we see. So here we see the collection's own life and dynamic, the intersection with and influence on other veins that inform and grow understanding and impact. And as such, the developing thesis for the veins of influence is simply this. It has developed during the course of this research as a concept to remind and a practice to follow, that with research of any material, encouraging the identification and investigation of influences on, from, and intersections with the considered material brings to light symbiotic dynamics. The idea also denotes the fluid nature of materials and the often unexpected, valuable life they may bring, and that is brought to them through such veins. Essentially, veins of influence remind us that these wonderful collections actually have a life, a throbbing life of their own that is waiting to be discovered. And so into the contemporary, this is what I ask you. Having seen these images, what are the perceptions now that you have of Ceylon then and Sri Lanka now? Are we better informed? Are those perceptions better informed? And should we go beyond the initial glance? So I would say we most certainly will, and I will certainly be doing that, to continue giving veins of life to the collection and its continuing narrative. These are questions which we will discuss a little later. Where does the Jermyn Folio belong? Is the PRM the correct repository? And then finally, I'm going to show you this and ask you to guess what it is later. And I thank you all for your kind time and patience.
Thank you so much, Shalini. That was absolutely fascinating and brought all sorts of questions to my mind. And there is a question in the Q&A. I have been fortunate enough to visit Sri Lanka on 2 occasions, most recently 1997, so some time ago. And thinking about that and also looking at these historic photos got me thinking, how far do photos like these in Western museums, how far do they come to define a perceived truth about Ceylon? Is it Ceylon through the colonial lens? It must be. Is this an idealized country rather than a reality? And if so, how can we know the reality?
Well, I think that this whole exercise, Andrew, this whole exercise is exactly pointing to that question. And what it is doing through the investigation of veins of influence is actually making that image more informed. And though on first impression, it's to understand that on first impression, it is not a complete image of a situation or a country or a people or a period. And so that there are questions that need to be asked and investigated to actually embolden that vision of a country before we conclude on what, or conclusively comment on what a certain period was or defined by.
Thanks. And I guess a further part of that, really thinking about that colonial lens and how I mean, you know, we can never see a truly objective view of the past. We can only see it subjectively interpreted from our position. But this folio lives at the moment in the Pitt Rivers Museum, and you questioned whether it should be in Lambeth or, you know, where should the Jermyn Folio belong? Should it be at the Pitt Rivers Museum? Has it ever returned to Sri Lanka? Should it return to Sri Lanka?
I think it really should stay at the Pitt Rivers Museum. It is a celebrated folio. The Pitt Rivers Museum has all the technology to keep it safely, but very importantly, there's a growing conversation to be had between the Pitt Rivers existing collection of Ceylon, both photographs as well as objects, because there are a number of select objects, not a lot, but a number. And there is a dynamic that should be developed, a conversation, part of which we have been introduced to through this presentation today, but also part of a larger conversation that the Pitt Rivers Museum should be engaging with external institutions like the V&A, like the Smithsonian. And this is really an opportunity to bridge and to loan out this collection to develop these conversations, not only for Ceylon. Note that this presentation is using Ceylon as a case study for a broader inquiry on veins of influence that it's not a time-limited concept. It's not just a colonial concept, but it's very important, certainly, to be applied to times where we do not have personal contact with that period.
Thanks. So, kind of following on from that, I suppose, is this. As far as I know, this collection has never been exhibited at the Pitt Rivers Museum. It's not available online, although elements of it are available online because you put them online, and I posted a link to that if anyone would like to go and have a look at it on the Oxford and Empire web presence on the University of Oxford website. But how could this work? I mean, you mentioned the V&A. How could this work be exhibited? Where would you exhibit it?
Well, I would like to actually see the Pitt Rivers Museum exhibiting it in a vignette exhibition that brings to light the existing photographic content on Ceylon, and then looks at the objects collected during this time or during a similar time, and which are part of the Pitt Rivers collection. For example, I know that there are small objects given or from collections of Charles Seligman, who is a very key figure in the study of the Vedas of Ceylon. So there are conversations and exhibitions to be developed around this theme, which again can be a pilot project or provide a format to look at other countries and other empire themes, with Pitt Rivers Museum really leading the fore.
Thanks. I'm going to go over to some of the comments and questions in the chat. Just a comment from Jeremy McClancy along the way. Shots of foliage have ferns in the foreground. Why? Because of Victorian fern mania? And that's a question mark. I guess we'll have to leave that one hanging, probably. Yes, I know.
It's one of the more curious images. Let's put it that way.
Right. Okay. Dennis Ganendra, who I guess probably has a connection to you, Shalini, asks, and there's a couple of questions about religious imagery in these photographs. So Dennis asks, how did the contrast between the predominant religions of Sri Lanka and the Christian background of the photographers affect the photographs? Which is a really interesting question, actually.
Okay, if the question is asking whether if the question is asking whether religion influences the eye of the photographer, I would imagine just as any photograph is a subjective endeavor, it would do so. Realize this photographer, Joseph Lawton, would have been Christian. I think that these photographs are much more documentary, and it would not have been a religious exercise, but rather an architectural exercise. And it's the selection process which might have had a religious overtone insofar as informing the viewers with whom this album was shared, informing them about the religious cultures of indigenous religious cultures of Ceylon.
Thanks. Yeah, Alistair Wright has written, which I think follows on pretty neatly from this. Does the album present a different view of Hindu and Buddhist buildings? And more broadly, did the British administrators, missionaries, etc., view Hinduism and Buddhism differently at the time in Ceylon?
Sorry, did
the does the album present a different view of Hindu and Buddhist buildings? Is there a parity, I guess, between Hinduism and Buddhism, and was there parity within the kind of colonial mindset, I suppose?
Well, the album actually, if we count up the number of, there's one image of the Hindu temple, there are no images of mosques, and there are about 5 or 6 images of the Galadari temple, the temple of the tooth, which is the Buddhist temple. Buddhism was and is the majority religion. It was most definitely the focus point of the missionaries and for conversion. And accordingly, we can see that it's heavily weighted in favor, certainly it would support in favor of the visual, since there are 6 images of the Buddhist temple. But also, I think that there is an architectural affinity that has appealed to the colonial sensibility, that this temple is captured in so many perspectives, whereas the Hindu temple, with its perhaps more foreign aesthetic, is featured once.
Okay, thanks. Continuing on a slightly religious theme, and you may not know the answer to this question. The question is, whose custody is the Christchurch Cathedral in today? Was it a church of South India in those days, like the St. Thomas Cathedral of Bombay was of the Church of North India? So yeah, what's
I don't think so. No, I would need to verify that, but I believe it had no association with India. It exists today as an Anglican church. It is the main Anglican church in Sri Lanka and remains as the cathedral.
And another question, which kind of brings us back to some of the questions I was asking at the beginning about the kind of about context and empire and those kind of things. Do the pictures lack depth without context of the culture and situation of Ceylon at that time?
It depends on what purpose they are being used for. So I think with any visual inquiry, even when we look at images today, we need to consider what is our responsibility as a viewer in terms of the depth that we need to be responsible for when viewing an image. And so if those images, what those images should be taken as at first glance is purely a first impression, and by no means a comprehensive view of what Ceylon was at the time. And I think that rule needs to be applied to any visual exercise that we engage in. There's the first impression, and there's the in-depth impression and the informed impression.
Great, thank you. And that's all the questions that are in the chat. I've got one final question for you, which really is a question you posed yourself at the end of your talk, Shalini. What is the image behind you and why are you using it?
Well, actually that image, thank you, Andrew, for noticing, because none of the chat group asked the question, but it's not a satellite. It is actually the torch ginger, and it is found both in Sri Lanka and Malaysia, and I personally love it. I think that it encapsulates exoticism, and when one looks at it, you know, if I had just shown the image and said, well, this is Sri Lanka or this is Malaysia, let's consider what we would have walked away with. And it's just there to make us consider what the image is and link us between Ceylon and Malaysia, which is exactly what this album has also done.
Well, I think that's a good place to call an end to this. Thank you so much, Shalini. It's really interesting talk. I'm going to go back and have another look at these photos through the Oxford University website, which I recommend anyone else to do. And yes, it gives me a hankering to go to Sri Lanka, but under current circumstances, I'm probably not going to achieve that. But thank you so much, Shalini.
And thank you to everyone. Thank you very much for your time.